People say miracles come softly, but out in the desert they come riding on horseback. This is the story of Jedediah Cain, a man whose past was as barren as the land he rode through. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, his eyes the color of a faded blue sky over the Arizona territory. He wasn't looking for trouble, but in the West, trouble had a way of finding you. That day, the sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth. Jedediah was tracking a stray steer, his horse, Dust Devil, plodding along with a familiar, tired rhythm. The heat shimmered off the sand, creating phantom lakes on the horizon. It was in one of these shimmering mirages that he saw it, a flicker of movement behind a dying saguaro cactus. Its arms slumped like a defeated giant. He reined in Dust Devil, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his colt. Squinting against the glare, he saw them. Two small figures, huddled together. As he rode closer, the figures resolved into two young girls, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. They were Apache, dressed in simple buckskin, their faces smudged with dust and tears. They couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. They trembled, not from cold, but from sheer terror. Jedediah dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. He spoke in a low, calm voice, using the few Apache words he'd picked up over the years. He offered them his canteen. The older girl snatched it, her movements quick and desperate, and gave her younger sister a long drink before taking one herself. They were dangerously dehydrated. They'd been lost for days, separated from their tribe during a sandstorm. He knew leaving them would be a death sentence. The desert showed no mercy, especially to the young and vulnerable. So he lifted the two girls onto Dust Devil, one in front of him, and one behind, and turned his horse not towards his ranch, but towards the distant mesas where he knew the Apache sometimes made camp. It was a long shot, but it was their only one. He found their people by dusk, a small band of Chiricahua led by a stern-faced chief. The relief that washed over the camp at the sight of the girls was palpable. The chief, whose name was Cochise, looked at Jedediah with a new appraising respect. There were no grand speeches, just a quiet nod of gratitude that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Jedediah simply tipped his hat and rode away, the silent thanks of a worried mother echoing in his mind. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. The next morning, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink, a rider appeared at his small, isolated ranch. It was a woman, alone. She was the mother of the girls he had saved. Her name was Nalin, and she carried a heavy leather pouch. She didn't speak a word of English, but her eyes conveyed a depth of gratitude that needed no translation. She dismounted and placed the pouch on his dusty porch. Jedediah tried to refuse. He hadn't saved her daughters for a reward, but Nalin was insistent, her gaze firm. With a final solemn nod, she mounted her horse and rode away, disappearing back into the vastness of the desert. Curious, Jedediah opened the pouch. He expected maybe some handcrafted jewelry or perhaps a few silver coins. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. Inside, nestled in soft deer hide, was a single, massive, uncut turquoise stone. It was the size of his fist, the color of a perfect robin's egg, with a dark web-like matrix running through it. He'd seen turquoise before, but never, ever anything like this. This wasn't just a rock, it was a king's ransom. A stone so rare and beautiful it was spoken of only in legends. The Apache called it the sky stone, a piece of the heavens fallen to earth. Word travels fast in the West, carried on the whispers of the wind and the gossip of saloon patrons. It wasn't long before the tale of the lone cowboy and his legendary sky stone spread from dusty outposts to bustling boomtowns. At first it was just a rumor, a tall tale to be shared over whiskey. But then, a geologist from back east, a man named Abernathy, heard the story and came seeking Jedediah out. Abernathy's eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw the stone. He confirmed its incredible value. He said a gem like that could fetch a price that would make a man rich beyond his wildest dreams. He offered to buy it on the spot, but Jedediah, feeling a strange connection to the stone, refused. The geologist left, disappointed but planting a dangerous seed. The legend was now a fact, and with fact came greed. The sky stone was no longer a blessing, it became a curse. Jedediah Cain, the quiet man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, was now a target. The first to come for it was Black Bart Corrigan, a notorious outlaw whose gang had been terrorizing the territory for years. Bart wasn't a man who asked nicely. He and his 5 men rode up to Jedediah's ranch one evening, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun. They didn't bother with pleasantries. Heard you found something that belongs to us, Bart growled, his hand resting on his pistol. Jedediah stood his ground on the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He knew this moment was inevitable. He had hidden the stone, but they wouldn't leave without searching, and they wouldn't leave him alive to tell the tale. The air grew thick with tension. Jedediah's mind raced. He was one man against 6. Suicide. But as Bart's men began to spread out, fanning across his yard, a sound broke the silence. It was the soft thrum of an arrow slicing through the air, followed by a choked cry. One of Bart's men crumpled to the ground, an arrow protruding from his chest. From the rocks and scrub surrounding the ranch, figures emerged. It was Cochise and a dozen of his warriors, silent as ghosts, their bows drawn. They had been watching. Nalin had told her chief about the stone. And Cochise knew the kind of danger it would bring to the man who had shown his people kindness. He had come to repay his debt. Bart Corrigan and his men were caught completely off guard. The outlaws, so used to being the predators, were now the prey. The fight was brutal and short. The crack of rifles mixed with the silent lethality of arrows. When the dust settled, Bart's gang was no more. Jedediah stood beside Cochise, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. "You saved my life," Jedediah said. Cochise simply replied, "You saved my future. We are even." Jedediah knew then that he couldn't keep the stone. It was too powerful, too dangerous. It didn't belong in his world of dust and cattle. It was a sacred object, a piece of Apache heritage. The next day, he rode out to meet Cochise. He held out the leather pouch. "This belongs with your people," he said. Cochise looked at the stone, then back at Jedediah. He took the pouch and, in return, handed Jedediah a beautifully crafted Apache hunting knife. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was a symbol of honor, respect, and a bond forged in the crucible of the desert. "You are a friend to the people," Cochise said. "You will always have a place here." Jedediah Kane returned to his quiet life. He was still just a cowboy, his hands still calloused, his face still weathered by the sun. He wasn't rich, not in the way the world measures wealth. But as he sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a richness that no amount of gold or turquoise could ever buy. He had faced down greed and violence, and in doing so, had found something far more valuable: friendship, honor, and a profound peace. People say miracles come softly, and maybe sometimes they do. But out in the vast, unforgiving desert, Jedediah learned that the greatest miracles aren't the ones that fall from the sky. They're the ones you find in the hearts of others, a reward unlike anything the West had ever seen. A reward that didn't end his life, but truly began it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales from the Old West. See you next time. The sun bled across the Arizona sky like a wound that refused to close. Dust curled behind the hooves of a lone horse as Reed Carson, a quiet cowboy with tired eyes, rode toward a small trading post miles beyond the reservation line. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. But trouble, it seemed, always had a way of finding him. Reed had spent years drifting from one ranch to another, trying to outrun memories of a home he'd lost and a family he couldn't save. Some men drowned their past in whiskey. Reed drowned his in the endless miles of open land. The wind was a kinder companion than most people, and the silence judged no one. But that evening, the silence was broken. At first, it was just a sound, carried on the wind thin, desperate, and unmistakably a cry. Then another. Reed pulled the reins so sharply his horse snorted in protest. His eyes scanned the vast, empty desert, his hand instinctively drifting toward the worn leather grip of his pistol. Not to kill, but to protect. Something deep in his chest tightened, an instinct older than fear itself. "Hello?" He called out, his voice swallowed by the vastness. There was no answer, only the restless wind whispering through the sagebrush. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and walked toward a cluster of rocky outcrops. Behind a bent, thirsty cactus, he found them. 2 little Apache girls, no older than 8 or 9. Their clothes were torn, their small feet bleeding from the harsh terrain. Their eyes were wide with a kind of fear that no child should ever have to know. One clutched the other as if she were the only solid thing left in the entire world. Reed crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate. He took off his hat, a simple gesture of respect. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice gentle. I ain't here to hurt you. The older girl flinched, her small body trembling. Bad man? Coming back, she whispered in broken English, her voice barely audible. Reed's jaw tensed. He understood immediately what that meant. Human trackers, outlaw kidnappers. The kind of men who saw no difference between livestock and children. He glanced around, his experienced eyes reading the story in the dust. Fresh tracks, boot marks, heavy and deep. Broken branches on a nearby bush. And not far off, he could see them 3 men on horseback, circling back to recover what they had failed to hold on to. There was no time to think, only to act. Get behind me, he told the girls, rising to his full height with a calmness he didn't feel. His hand slid from his belt to his sidearm, fingers wrapping around the familiar cold steel. His breath slowed, his focus narrowing. He'd promised himself he wouldn't fall back into violence again, that he'd left that life behind. But some promises, he realized, weren't meant to be kept when innocence was on the line. The outlaws saw him. Their laughter was a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the desert's peace. One of them shouted, his voice dripping with arrogance. Walk away, cowboy. Those kids ain't yours. Reed didn't move an inch. He stood as a silent guardian between the predators and their prey. They are now, he said, his voice low and steady. A tense, electric silence split the desert air. The world seemed to hold its breath. The first outlaw, emboldened by his own cruelty, went for his gun, but Reed was faster. A single shot echoed across the plains, sharp and final, then another, and a third. The dust kicked up, swallowing the fallen bodies. The outlaws' horses, panicked, scattered into the twilight. When the wind finally settled and the dust began to clear, the little girls looked at Reed. The terror was gone from their eyes, replaced by something else, the quiet, trembling relief of those who know they've been saved. Saved by a stranger who owed them nothing, yet had just risked everything. Come on, Reed said gently, his voice softening again. I'll get you home. He didn't know where their home was, but he knew he had to try. He carefully lifted the younger girl onto his horse, then helped the older one up behind her. As they rode toward the distant lights of the Apache camp, Reed found himself wondering. What kind of mother had to let her children wander so far from safety? And what would she say when she learned that a lone, nameless cowboy had been their unlikely savior? He didn't expect gratitude. He certainly didn't expect any more danger. But the next morning, as the first rays of sun painted the reservation in hues of gold and red, their mother arrived. She walked with a quiet dignity, her face unreadable. In her hands she carried something carefully wrapped in a vibrant red cloth. It was a reward, but not the kind of reward this weary cowboy ever saw coming. And it was about to change the direction of his lonely path forever. What she offered him was not just a thank you, but a new beginning, a debt that would bind his fate to theirs in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, the sun spilled golden across the vast, empty desert, turning the endless sand into a glittering sea of light. Reed had barely slept a wink. The girls, the 2 small souls he'd pulled from the jaws of danger, had stayed with him at the small, dusty cabin he rented near the edge of the reservation. Throughout the night, their quiet chatter and the soft rustle as they played with wildflowers they de-picked along the trail filled the small space. Their laughter was a fragile sound, almost out of place in this harsh land, yet it reminded him of something he thought he'd lost forever, a glimmer of hope. Then, as the morning sun climbed higher, she came. She appeared at the cabin door, a silhouette against the brilliant light, walking with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a woman who had weathered more storms than the desert itself. Her eyes were sharp dark and filled with a wisdom that seemed to stretch back generations. They scanned Reed, not just looking at him, but seeming to measure the very fabric of his soul. In her arms she carried a bundle wrapped in a deep red cloth, held close to her chest. The wind, ever present in these parts, tugged at her shawl, and dust swirled around her worn boots, but she stood firm, an immovable presence. Reed Carson, she said. Her voice was steady, yet it carried a weight of emotion he couldn't quite decipher. It was a voice that had known both profound sorrow and immense strength. You saved my girls. Reed, caught off guard by her directness, instinctively tipped his hat, a gesture of respect ingrained in him from a lifetime on the frontier. Ma'am, he replied, his own voice sounding rougher than he'd intended. Just did what anyone would have. They were in danger. The woman studied him for a long, silent moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind. She wasn't just looking at his weathered face or his dusty clothes. She was looking into him, searching for the man behind the gruff exterior. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached into the red bundle. Reed's heart pounded in his chest. He expected money, maybe some trinket of value. But what she pulled out made his breath catch and his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't gold, nor sparkling jewels, nor anything he had ever associated with a reward. Instead, it was a hand-carved totem of the Apache spirit protector. It was shaped like a wolf, small enough to fit in his palm, yet it radiated a power, a significance, that he could feel deep in his bones, even without understanding the ancient language of its creators. The craftsmanship was intricate, every line carved with purpose. "This," she said, her voice now softer as she pressed the totem into his hands, "is the heart of my family. It carries our gratitude, our trust, and our protection. You may not see its power now, but it will guide you when the road ahead is dark and you feel lost." Reed looked down at the totem resting in his calloused palm. His fingers, clumsy and rough, traced the smooth, worn wood, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. It was heavier than it looked, not in physical weight, but in its immense significance. He felt the sharp, unexpected sting of tears welling in his eyes, the kind of emotion men like him were taught to bury deep and never show, but he couldn't escape it. Why this?" he managed to ask, his voice cracking, betraying the wall he'd built around his heart. Her gaze was unwavering. "Because you saved life without asking for a reward," she said simply, but her words struck him like a thunderclap. "And the world needs more men who do not wait for thanks before they act. Let this remind you. True courage is more than just bravery in a fight. It is heart. It is compassion. It is selflessness. And that is a rare and precious thing." As she spoke, the girls, sensing the gravity of the moment was over, ran to their mother, clinging to her skirt. They glanced back at Reed, their wide, adoring eyes shining with an innocence that pierced right through him. They had no idea of the profound weight of what had just happened, of the shift that had just occurred within him. Yet somehow, on a level beyond words, they knew he had changed the course of their lives forever. The mother spoke again, her voice now a soft whisper that the wind seemed to carry directly to him. "May the wolf guide you, Reed Carson, and may you never forget. You are never alone on your path." With that, she turned and, with her children in tow, walked away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat of the desert as quietly as she had arrived. The wind carried her words, and they seemed to settle deep within his heart, planting a seed of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Reed looked down at the wolf totem clutched in his hand and finally understood. This was more than a reward. It was a legacy. It was a sacred reminder that even in a harsh, unforgiving world, a single act of courage, no matter how small or unnoticed, creates ripples. Ripples that touch lives in ways a man could never predict or imagine. He swung himself onto his horse, the worn leather of the saddle a familiar comfort, but something was different. He felt lighter than he had in years, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He glanced back at the trail, now empty except for the dancing dust devils and the unrelenting sunlight. The girls, their mother, the desperate struggle, they were all behind him now, fading into memory. Yet they had moved something deep inside him, awakened a part of his soul that would never fade. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Reed didn't feel like a wandering shadow, a ghost haunted by his past. He felt alive. And more than that, he felt a surge of hope, bright and fierce as the desert sun. He kicked his horse gently forward, letting the wind carry him across the endless expanse. Ahead of him lay uncertainty, danger, and the raw adventure of the unknown. But now, he carried something far more powerful than fear or regret. He had a purpose. He had a reason. And somewhere, carried on the whisper of the wind, he thought he heard a faint echo, a promise from the universe itself. Courage does not go unnoticed, even in the smallest of hearts. Reed smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. And he rode on, not away from his past, but towards a future he was finally ready to build. True courage, he now knew, isn't measured by wealth or fame. It's measured by selflessness, by heart, and by the simple, profound willingness to act when no one else will. Even one single act of bravery has the power to change lives forever, creating a legacy that outlasts time itself. Thanks for watching. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.